that must be yours. Is that mine? We welcome you here this morning.
My reading this morning is from the NIV, and I'm hoping that this is all going to work out. As the deer pants for streams of water, so my soul pants for you, my God. That's Psalm 42, verse 1. And then we go to 1 Corinthians 13, verses 8 to 13, again in the NIV. Love never fails, but where there are prophecies, they will cease. Where there are tongues, they will be stilled. Where there's knowledge, it will pass away. For we know in part and we prophesy in part. When completeness comes, what is in part disappears. When I was a child, I talked like a child. I thought like a child. I reasoned like a child. When I became a man, I put the ways of childhood behind me. For now we see only reflection as in a mirror. Then we shall see face to face. Now I know in part, then I will know fully, even as I am fully known. And now these three remain: faith, hope, and love. But the greatest of these is love. Thank you. May the Lord bless the reading of His Word.
Good morning. I wonder if you could take out, there's an insert in your sheet, in your bulletin. I wonder if you could take that out. For those of you who are visiting this morning, Pastor Paul has been walking us through a variety of the stories of King David over the last few months, and when he asked me to follow through, I asked if he was finished with David or would he be coming back, and he said, well, he's going to do a couple more when he's back. So I said I would like to spend some time talking about one of the Psalms. It's one of my favorites. The Bible itself is an amazing treasury of, basically it's a journal of a community that, for the first 3 quarters of it anyway, is the journal of the Jewish community for about 2,000 years. And they collected their literature of what they had figured out about God's idea when He invented this place. And then the last quarter of the Bible, which we know as the New Testament, basically is, as my Old Testament prof would say, that's the appendix at the back. It's the part that is the record of the start of the taking of all that wonderful treasury and bringing it out to us in other parts of the world. A little project that Jesus had in mind when He was around. So what I'd like to do today is I'd like to... well, let me put it this way. In the Hebrew language, which is what the Old Testament was originally written in, there's no word for the idea to show. You can't show anybody anything and ask a teacher of junior high kids and they would agree, right? But you can hopefully create a context in which people can see. And that's what I want to do today. So you're going to have to work. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to open up this psalm and sort of create a space to help you to understand what's going on there. So perhaps in that you can see the parts that are relevant to you and that God can bring to life to you. Many of us are familiar, of course, with the 23rd Psalm, the Lord's my shepherd. I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. He restores my soul. And, of course, the subtext in that, the assumption underneath it is, you too can be still waters. You too can be a pasture. I know that because my wife is that. And I was working in a community development project out in Saskatchewan for a year, and she would come out on the weekends. And that was the first time I understood that aspect of married life, where she didn't have to say anything or do anything. She just had to walk in the room, and I quieted down. And so she is the still water that God leads me beside, let me tell you. Well, today you're going to learn something else. In Psalm 42, which is the one that's printed on your sheet there, you're going to learn that you can be a waterfall as well as still water. And we want to talk about that and where that comes from. In the psalm, the best way into the psalm is right at the middle. On the right-hand side, you'll see "Enter here," jotted on the sidelines. And that middle verse there, "My soul is cast down within me, therefore I remember thee from the land of Jordan." Okay, that's a good place to start because that gives us the clue as to what's going on. I myself write a lot of poetry, write novels. I'm a photographer, a landscaper. That does not include gardening. I hate weeding. So if any of you feel like you really want to weed, just let me know after the service. But I have a lot of connections with the artistic community. But I've also come to understand, because of my background as a minister and as a counselor and an advisor at the university, that that's also an art, as is being a grandparent and being a parent. So if you feel you're being left out, don't. This particular psalm comes from a man, as we see at the top there, is one of the sons of Korah. So who the heck are the sons of Korah? Well, as we know, David was a guy who liked to play the harp, which is the old-fashioned guitar. This was the group he used to jam with. And Brandon being a music city, we have lots of little groups of people who like to go around and gather on Wednesday night or whatever, or play in a variety of venues, and just like to spend time playing music, making music, because music's a great way to do it. This particular group, we know that David not only liked to jam with, but he set them up. Like, he had enough money to sponsor these guys, and they were set up well. And they had a role to play in the worship service of the community, but also were looked after pretty well because he liked these people. And we know they were high-quality musicians because 25 of our 150 psalms are written by people from that particular group, and this is one of them. We know from what Paul told us about David in his first 10 years or so of public life, that he was chased around the countryside by King Saul, who by this time had gone insane and was making life miserable for a lot of people. And these people gathered together around David, and by the end of his time, there was a band of them that was running around being chased over the various parts of the countryside in fear of their life. If you look at the little map on the left-hand side there, you'll see a sketch of Mediterranean Sea on the left and Mount Hermon at the top right there. And then you have the Jordan River, Sea of Galilee, Dead Sea, and so on, Jerusalem. Sort of a marshland between the Dead Sea, or between the Sea of Galilee and Mount Hermon. And just at the bottom of Mount Hermon is a waterfall. Some of you will remember Jesus, who when he went up north, you know, the Transfiguration story and all that kind of stuff, when he headed up north and things were getting a little hot in Capernaum. Well, that's where he headed for, the waterfall. Nobody tells us that, but you Google it. It's beautiful, absolutely beautiful. So this waterfall is what he seems to be talking about in this particular psalm. We know that it was written much later because of some of the references there where he's looking back on a time when he was part of this group that led the worship and so on in the temple. But it seems to have been written, my guess is, at the time when David's son Absalom ran a coup and chased David and his people out of Jerusalem. They eventually fought their way back, and Absalom was killed. But during that time, my guess is this man was involved in that. He was one of the ones who was chased out of town, and he's looking back at that time. But there's something else that's going on here as well, and that is the man was in a depression. My soul is cast down within me. and therefore I remember from the land of Jordan, and so on. What's he saying here? Now you go down to the bottom there, they get another expression of this as, why art thou cast down, O my soul, and why art thou disquieted within me? Anybody, those of us who've been through various stages of depression for whatever reason, and there's a lot of reasons for going into depression, anybody who's been through there can relate to those lines. Because this is where, as some people have noted, sometimes you throw a switch and it won't throw back. Sometimes you go into a depression and you can't pull out. It's like the time I came over the bridge in Winnipeg at 5 o'clock traffic in my little old beat-up Toyota and the brakes failed. It's like you have a feeling of going somewhere, but you can't control it. I've heard of other people who's blown a tire in the front and suddenly the control of the car's gone. It's that kind of a feeling, and it's this, why are you cast down inside me, O my soul? You know, why are you disquieted within me? These periods of depression can hit us when times are good, and they can hit us when times are bad. And what seems to have happened here is, in both cases for this guy, this experience of depression happened when he was having a bad time as well, which is really a double whammy. The first time is what he refers to in that middle verse. Therefore I remember thee from the land of Jordan, from this earlier experience when you pulled me out of this dive. What was that about? Well, we know that David had a number of very close calls, and my guess is that these people he used to hang around with also had some close calls, maybe at the same time. This particular close call seemed to have taken place at the base of Mount Hermon, at the waterfall, where he was running for his life, scrambled down in there, and got lost in the brambles. Just managed to escape. While he was down there, two things happened. One was the roar of the waterfalls got to him. Anybody who's been to Niagara Falls or the ones up on the Mackenzie Highway, you know, they echo in us. And the deep in them calls to the deep in us, which is the line that he has just after that, which is deep calls unto deep at the thunder of thy cataracts, that is, thy waterfalls. That God's able to speak to us, to lift us, to carry us, to move us, whatever kind of things we have need of. He's able to do that in any number of ways, one of which, of course, is nature, which we are experiencing this summer. The second thing that happened was that while he was down there, this deer came down there for a drink. Only this deer didn't just come down, wandering down because he wanted a drink. This deer came down the same way he came down, chased by a hunter. He came down there, and his lungs were panting, and he was desperate for a drink. And he sat there in the bushes, and he watched this deer come up, take a drink, and just find incredible refreshment. In this experience, somehow he was lifted up out of his depression, and he found help, which gives rise to this line, my soul is cast down within me, therefore I remember thee from the land of the Jordan and from Mount Hermon. I remember. And he goes on a little later on to say, hope in God, and I shall again praise him, my help and my God. That is, I trust that he'll pull me out of this one too, but he's not out of it yet. So, we experience here, or we hear of this man's experience of getting out of a depression, getting out of a bad situation, through an experience in nature. And just like I said earlier, You get to be the still waters, the quiet pasture. You can also be a waterfall to the people around you. Because deep calls to deep in everything in life. It calls to deep in us, with our children, our grandchildren, with our parents, with our kids at school, with the community members, people in AA, the counselees, counselors. The deep in us calls to the deep in others, and it is this lovely dance of humanity as we get to know each other and we find ourselves lifted by the people around us. That God works through us too, not just through waterfalls. So the question is then, what do you have to do to be a waterfall? What do you have to do to have that kind of effect on people around you? First of all, go deep yourself. And there's lots of ways of doing that. This little building here is basically a greenhouse for growing people. There's about 35 or 40 of them scattered throughout the city of different brands and branches. A whole bunch more in the hinterland around here. They're great places. They're not places full of perfect people. They're places full of people just like greenhouses are full of plants that are in process of growing up. And so if you want to find a place that tends to go that way, it doesn't always work out that way. You know, we're human beings. Sometimes it gets a little lumpy around these places, but it can be quite good. So find one and mosey up to people. Certainly in the Native community as well, there's the same equivalent. There's lots of resources within that community for growth and guidance from elders and sweats and a whole bunch of other resources that are there for people who find that God can speak to them and support them and help them within that, to grow deep within that particular avenue. There's lots of resources around, which of course is what many of us as artists are involved in, the providing of books and poetry and lots of things on the internet and lots of programs, counseling programs and horse therapy programs and just government programs. There's lots of them. So there's lots of places. If you want to grow deep, if you want to move into depth in your own life, it's not because there isn't any resources around. At this day and age, there's just huge amounts of resources. But again, people can't show you anything. The best they can do is kind of open up some resources and allow you a place where you can come and perhaps see. That brings really the question of what is the artist's task? Those of us who provide resources that go into the community, we never see the people who they touch. It's twofold. One is to see things in something else. That is to reach into the life around us and notice something, and then the second part is to hold it up and say, hey, did you notice this? As this poet is doing here. Did you notice the thunder in the cataracts and the deer? He's holding this up. Did you see this? That God helped me through this. Maybe he can help you through in some way as well. So that we see stuff and that we hold it up. For example, take this little church here. I was around here about 1980s, and I was away for a while and came back here. It hasn't changed all that much. And the marvelous thing about this particular little outfit is that their specialty is helping people get back on track. They don't do it in big fancy programs and all that kind of stuff, but they do it by interpersonal contact. Sort of like the rural church that we used to know back in the olden days, where people just were people, and they came to kind of get along with each other, and they came up alongside each other and kind of helped each other out. And so that as you reach in and you grasp sort of what is the essence, and each of these little greenhouses around town has something like that. So find one that works for you. And if you don't understand what makes it tick, maybe ask somebody and they'll tell you. So we get to be a waterfall, and we get to be deep. And then how do we go? Where do we go from there? Well, we become deep for other people. And that is partly, of course, the artist's task, to try and provide access to this kind of depth so people can get access to it wherever they happen to be, through the internet or reading or through the songs on the radio or whatever. I remember this couple in Kenora when I was a minister in Kuwaitan. I ran into this young couple who were singing in the pub in Kenora. And I got chatting with them, and they mentioned that for them, it was a huge battle every night they went in. That is, there was this negative drag down that was going on within the pub, and they were up there mostly being ignored by everybody, singing songs, and they were trying to bring people this direction. And it's just, you can do it in any old way you want. It's just finding a way to be deep for others, to provide the depth, like a waterfall, that then the depth calls to them and calls them out to their better self. You say, well, I'm not very smart. Well, you've got to be smarter than a waterfall. I don't have a very big heart. Well, you got a bigger heart than a deer. You know, like, it's for anybody. And it's as we get deep, we share depth. And a lot of it isn't something we got to do, it's just something we got to be. Waterfalls don't go out and sort of say, hey, can I lift you up? They just roar. So, at least you can roar. Over this last summer, just in order to keep my mind alive, I've been working my way through Chris Orwick's book, Visual Poetry. He's a photo instructor at Brooks Institute of Photography in California, and he reads a lot of poetry. He doesn't write it, but he reads a lot of poetry, and he noticed that a lot of the photographs that he tries to make and tries to help some of his students make are basically visual poems, and he sort of talks about that. So I've been working my way through it. He made a very interesting comment in his chapter on portraits. What he said was this. He said, there are a lot of beautiful people out there. There are a lot of really beautiful scenes out there. There are a lot of beautiful things in the world. But if all you do is capture the surface, you missed it. As an artist, reach into the person, get beneath the skin, find the person, and hold that up. Deep calls to deep. Listen to their depth, provide your depth, and mix that together into a photograph so that when other people see it, they say, I never knew that about that person. I never saw that about that person. So let's explore that a little bit. That is, how do you be a waterfall in your little part of the country? How do you provide the depth, the roar that other people hear, respond to, and then find themselves lifted up as God is able to work through that transaction? Last weekend, I had the privilege of being at a wedding up in Clear Lake. And there were 3 sisters plus one other girl who was a daughter of a friend of mine who I ran into at that wedding. You've all heard the expression, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. Well, that's those 4 girls. If you saw these 4 beautiful girls just sitting there and were just taking their picture, and that's all you saw was just 4 beautiful girls, you'd have 4 beautiful pictures. But if you get to know them a little, this is what you'd see. The youngest one was all heart. She was, heart on wheels. I mean, this lady had amazing joy, amazing just love of people, just this amazing relational capacity. Wonderful. The middle daughter, she was soul. Deep, deep pool. It's one of those people, you know, you kind of look over the edge and say, whoa, I don't think there's a bottom there. It just goes down and down and down. All the blues music out of the South and the States comes out of that same tradition. The oldest daughter, mind. This lady's sharp. Psychologist, works out in Edmonton. Brilliant, sensitive, very sharp person. And I guess if they had had a 4th daughter, they might have had what this other girl provided, which was strength. This girl was back from Alberta, and she's visiting her family, and she's the one who paddles down the Nahanni Gorge and then runs marathons and goes to South America and rides down mountains on bicycles and, pushes the envelope. Strength, real strength. So if you were to take pictures of just the four of them and not know that, you just have four beautiful women. But once you understand the people, and you say, I want to capture something of each of those women, you would have four totally different photographs. Because you'd reached in, grasped a little bit of who this person was, and held it up. Now you say, wow, why would I want to do that? Well, let me tell you. The first 4 years of my work as a minister, I was on a reservation up in northern Ontario, right where Manitoba goes up and bends towards Hudson Bay. I was right in the pocket there, a place called Sandy Lake. When we were up there, they had no radio, no roads, no TVs, no internet, no nothing. And when we first went there, some of that started to come in towards the end. And what we saw and what we experienced, of course I was a dumb 20-year-old, so I didn't understand what the beauty of what I was getting. But we got to see one of those communities that was on this continent before it broke up. Amazing. And I walked into the church, of course, and I was hot out of college and all hot to trot and smart person guy. Anyway, they had 23 elders who had basically nothing but the Bible and the hymn book to entertain them with, and they had got to know it very well. And their form of entertainment at the time was they would crack it open and say, well, this is an interesting passage. I wonder what I have to do to bring my life into line with this. And they'd been doing that for years. So these guys were like walking spiritual bottomless pits. I mean, they were incredible people. And I knew a lot about the Bible, but I didn't know it in that way. And so they had a very interesting way of operating. We would arrive at the back of the church on Sunday morning, and there was two leaders, one of whom was in charge of assigning who was going to preach and who was going to take the prayer, because all the elders preached. And so Monius would take a cigarette at 11 o'clock and stamp it out and say, okay, you preach and you take the prayer, and we'd walk in. We had no idea who it was going to be. Well, that was a whole new way of doing life for me. So I took my translator aside and I said, okay, what kind of an outlook on life would give rise to this? And they said, well, if you're a growing Christian, which we assume everybody is, you'll have something to share. And if you're having a bad week because there's something going on, you'll just beg off. But normally, you just take your turn. I took a deep breath and said, oh, that makes sense, but I guess I better get growing. And it was the best thing that ever happened to me, because basically what they were saying was, deep calls to deep. We expect you to be deep, we are deep, and we share with each other. One of the gifts that they gave me was this. I had grown up in a society very similar to the one that goes on in Brandon here now, and that goes like this. When I'm with my teacher, I'm this way. When I'm with my minister, I'm this way. When I'm with my friends, I'm this way. When I'm with my parents, I'm this way. When I'm with my doctor, I'm this way. And then at night, when I go home and sit on the edge of my bed, I say to myself, self, would the real Stu please stand up? Am I more real with my doctor, with my minister, with my teacher, with my peers? Who am I? Big problem in this society. That's not the way it was run up there. These guys are consistent. That is, somebody tells you, we're going to have a meeting, this is the subject, and then you say, well, who's going to be there? You say, well, this one, this one, this one. Well, he'll say this, he'll say this, he'll say this, and he'll say this, because they're consistent. You know exactly what they're going to say, or pretty close. Well, it was interesting how they treated me, because I didn't know who I was. I had sort of a hunch, I had a few clues, and sort of a mishmash. But they weren't used to dealing with that, but they were used to dealing with was reaching straight through, grabbing me, holding up the rest, and blowing the rest away. What an incredible gift to have a community do that to you for 4 years. And consistently. They seemed to know me, but I didn't know me. But that's how I got to know me. Deep calls to deep. They recognized the deep in me, responded to that, and held it up so I could see it. So, like I say, you can be a waterfall too, regardless of your job, regardless of what artistic medium you work in, whether it's writing, whether it's acting, whether it's film work, doesn't matter. The deep that you find not only in the people around you, but in the world around you, as you reach into the world of whatever it happens to be. We have a man here in this poem who is hearing the deep in nature. You can hear it anywhere. The thing is to reach in and hold it and bring it up. If you turn the page over, you'll find there's a little line there that we read out of 1 Corinthians 13. It's the sum-up punchline. So faith, hope, and love abide, these three, but the greatest of them is love. And that's what he's talking about. Let me show how it works. If you look down, there's a little arrow going down, across, and then going up. Everybody likes nice situations and nice people. And then you drop down a little bit. People leave when things deteriorate. No, life's too short. I don't need this kind of hassle. A few people stay around who see with the eyes of faith something below the surface that is nice. Not nice on the surface, but they just somehow see with the eyes of faith. But as the situation deteriorates, you move down the page there, as the situation continues to deteriorate, more people leave. A few people stay around who hope jumps up in. And they would be a liar to say it didn't. They walk into a situation, they meet that person, and hope jumps up and says, you know, there's hope here. And they stay around. Go down a little farther. But then when things continue to deteriorate, most of those people are now gone. And if you're lucky, one or perhaps two will be around who say, not nice, nothing under the surface, absolutely no hope for this turkey, but he needs my help, or she needs my help. Most of us can't do more than a few of those during our lifetime because they are so much of a drain on our life. They are very costly. Very, very costly. But this is the amazing level, because this is the level where deep calls to deep. This is the level where Indian elders work. This is the level where the sponsors, the old-timers in AA work, who are able to just give that stability and guidance and direction for people moving on in their life out of addiction. This is where all the people who have become deep themselves move in and do that magic work, the miracle work. And if it's going to turn around, and often it doesn't, but if it's going to turn around, this is where it turns around. I learned this when I was in grade 6. My mom was one of these people. We were living in Winnipeg at the time, and there was a young girl who had had a bad home situation, and she was in our class at school. We knew her, and we knew that if you ever smiled at her, she would just lock onto you because she was so desperate for any kind of companionship and love. She wasn't getting anything at home or anywhere else. Well, when I got to grade 6, we'd had about 3 or 4 years of this girl already, and when I got to grade 6, she ended up in my mother's Sunday school class. And my mom was the kind of Sunday school teacher who used to have the kids over for pizza parties or over for breakfast at their place, at her place, instead of at the church and things like that. And we would see this going on. Then I started to notice something. That this girl who was in our class was being brought over early to help set the table. And who was being talked with after school. And this lady just started to pour in the love. That's what I'm talking about here. Very practical. Deep calls to deep. She saw something in that girl and said, this girl needs it, and I'm going to give it because my name is on this. Well, we went our separate ways. I didn't see her again until in grade 11. I was coming home from a kids camp. I was a lifeguard at a kids camp up north of Winnipeg, and I had to come home, change buses down Hudson Bay Company, and then hop a bus out to St. James. And I went into the Hudson Bay Company and went through the revolving door, and she came out the other one. I couldn't believe it. I just kept walking. It's like, holy moly. Here was this girl, beautiful, poised, interested in somebody besides herself. I was just like flabbergasted. What happened? Well, here's what happened. That woman had poured in a lot of love. As I was riding home on the bus that afternoon out at St. James, I got thinking about this, and I realized all this stuff Because you see that little arrow that goes up on the right-hand side of the page? As people start to pour in the love, people start to respond. The deep calls to deep. They start to mature. They start to settle down. They start to become who God had in mind when He invented them. And then along come some people who feel hope. And they say, hey, there's hope in that little chick. And so they start hanging around, and they start to bring up some of the freight and carry some of the freight of this and speed up the process. And it goes along a little farther, and then come along the people who can see under the surface and with the eyes of faith and say, hey, I see something here. No, it's not nice yet, but hey, there's something much more here. And they start to also carry some of the freight. And then comes that magical day, like me and the Hudson Bay Company, when we go spinning through the revolving door and saying, what happened there? Well, this is what happened there. Deep calls to deep. And sometimes our name's on it. And we start to respond, we start to move, and then God has some room to operate, and we become the waterfall. There is a little story I'd like to close with. It's told by, it's either Youngie Cho or Watchman Nee, I forget which. The story comes out of the Far East. There was a single mom who had she had a young girl who was growing up, was a lovely little girl, lots of hope, brilliant, bright eyes, everything was just going along well. And sometime when she hit her teenage years, she went off the rails, which sometimes happens. And she took off, was living on the streets, and made an absolute mess of her life, just trashed everything. It was no good. Her mother tried everything to try and get her to, come around and sort of move back into a quality life, and it just was not happening. So finally one day she went to see a minister friend of hers and poured out her heart to him and said, I don't know. I don't know what to do. My heart is just breaking over this young girl. And the minister listened for a while, and then he said, well, it's interesting. You've presented to me 2 photographs. The first photograph is of this young girl who had all the hope, all the wonder of this potential of a beautiful life. And the second picture you give me is this girl who's absolutely trashed everything, and she's thrown it all away. The human mind is capable of only holding one of those 2 pictures. You have to throw one away. Which one is real? She said, the little kid. Well, you got to throw the other one away. Never think of it again, never respond to it, only respond to this one. You may be the only one in the universe who still has a vision of that girl. Her teachers may have forgotten her. Her playmates may have long forgotten her. You may be the only one who remembers the hope, the promise, and the reality of that kid. Deep calls to deep. There's your deep. Be a waterfall. So, the woman went home and sort of gulped and said, whew, there's a big challenge. Because what he said was, when you pray for that girl, think of that girl. When you meet her, talk to only that girl. That is the only person you're to deal with. Throw the other one away. Everybody else can hold up the other one if they want to, but for you, hold on to that one. Be the waterfall. A few months later, the girl showed up on her doorstep, little suitcase in hand, and banged on the door. And her mom opened the door and remembered what the minister had said, threw her arms around her and said, come on in. The girl settled down, got her life back together, and told her mom later that she was giving her one more chance. And if she had to hit her with the same stuff that she hit her with before, she would never come back. In my final sermon in Sandy Lake when I left, I wondered what I should talk about, and I talked about what I'd learned there. Because I learned more from them than they ever learned from me, let me tell you. And the main thing I learned was about forgiveness. That I saw them again and again and again do exactly what that story talks about. They would see their kids go south to school and go through an absolute meat grinder and not respond to it very well sometimes, and they would come limping back to the reserve to catch their breath. And again they would be met at the door with, "Come on in, son. You didn't have a hot chance in hell. Take your boots off, we'll talk about it another time." And I saw those kids, over those 4 years I was there and the many years after, I saw them settle down, become members of the community, and rise up and become the people God had in mind when He invented each of them. That's the possibility that's there for us in this little poem that was written something like, 1,500, that's 2,000, that's 3,500 years ago. The dynamics haven't changed. It's still there. So you can become deep, and you can share that depth with the people around you. That's the possibility. Why are you cast down, O my soul? And why are you disquieted within me? Is the cry from the person on the inside. And the cry from the other side is, "Come on in. Take your shoes off." We'll talk about it another time. Let's pray. Our Heavenly Father, we thank you for this musician who shared his heart or her heart with us. We thank you for the vision that he holds up for us. And we thank you for, in doing so, the chance to respond as parents, grandparents, peers at school, as counselors, as just ordinary people on the street. That as we see our opportunity and we hear you move our hearts in relation to the people around us, saying that if you can just do a little of this or a little of that, you'll give me some room to operate, and I'll do the heavy lifting. We thank you that we can indeed come unto you with our burdens and find them lifted and carried and our burden lightened. We pray in Christ's name.